Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this DriveTech Policing Insights webinar. Here to discuss what, as you'll see on the screen there, we're describing as the biggest ever overhaul of mandatory vehicle safety requirements. Very timely that we should be having this discussion today, the morning after a report was released by the European Transport Safety Council yesterday, which said there'd been more UK deaths on the roads in 2019 than there were in 2010. And only across the EU, not that we're in the EU anymore, of course, but across Europe, only the UK, Netherlands and Malta are experiencing deteriorating rates, albeit all of them from pretty strong starting positions. So contemporarily, a very relevant subject. Let's start by inviting Charlie Norman, the Managing Director of DriveTech, to formally open proceedings.
Morning, everybody. Apologies, I don't think you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. So yes, morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As Nick says, I'm Charlie Norman, Managing Director here at DriveTech. Thanks for joining. Today you'll hear more about the upcoming vehicle safety features, which I recently wrote about in Policing Insight. And that article followed on from our white paper on the same subject. And today you'll hear from Ian Bint. Ian's in the policing team here at DriveTech, and he was also the author of that paper. I personally think it's a fascinating subject, lots of upcoming change, very closely aligned to our vision at DriveTech, which is driven to keep people safe. So really exciting prospects this new technology will bring to road safety. I think it's hard to say it's anything other than a good thing, but I think we all want to make sure it has the best chance of delivering the impact on road safety that we all want it to. And on that point in the white paper, Ian pulled out a couple of issues and concerns, which I think are worthy of debate. These included, possible unreliability of the equipment. Is there a risk the driver relinquishes control of or responsibility of the vehicle? Will the driver know how to use it? I think we probably all know people that have cruise control on their vehicles and never use it because they don't know how to, and therefore don't get the benefit from it. So I think that led us to question the validity of a lifetime driving license over some form of continuous driver education. So I think it's a worthy debate, and as Nick says, good timing. So delighted that in addition to Ian, we've got 4 other special guests joining us today who we'll hear from later. So my big thanks to Dr. Helen Wells, Director of the Roads Policing Academic Network, John Apter, Chair of the Police Federation, Ruth Purdie, CEO of UKROEd, and Bernard Ricks, Publisher of Policing Insight, who, as Nick says, partnered with us today to put on this webinar. And finally, thanks to Nick Gargan from Keep Up Consultancy for facilitating today's presentation. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Nick, who'll guide us through the agenda.
Thanks very much indeed, Charlie. Very soon we'll hear from Ian Bint. Just 2 things before we do. The first is to let participants know that the proceedings this morning are being recorded, and it's our intention that they will end up on the Policing Insight website. So if there's anything of particular interest, you'll be able to come back to it, but also just a fair warning to everybody that you are on the record, as it were. Secondly, after Ian, we're going to hear from Helen and John, but also there'll be questions involving Ruth and Bernard straight after that. So please don't feel you need to wait until the end of the presentation to ask your question. If you have the GoToWebinar control panel to your right, you can see where you can click on questions, and as you click on the questions tab, you have an opportunity to ask questions there, ask them now, and we can feed them through to our speakers at a convenient moment. So without further ado, let's hear from the report author Ian Bint and ask him to present his findings to us.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good morning, everybody. A mandatory vehicle safety requirement. It's quite a mouthful, even more so when you call it that, which I'm not even going to go through. Type approval requirements. Normally very passive things. Why would we concern ourselves with those? Surely they're just things that manufacturers look for and build cars in different way. But these type approval regulations are different, very different. They actually affect the way the driver interacts with the vehicle and the way the driver interacts with other road users. And it's for that reason that we've focused on them and done this webinar. I'll start with a bit of history. You'll probably be quite familiar with this graph if you're in road safety. It was the target to reduce road deaths by 50% between 2010 and 2020. The dotted line is the target line, and that was EU-wide, and the solid line is the progress that was made. Really good progress made to 2013, and then since 2013, very limited progress has been made. It's of concern to us because road deaths are the greatest killer of 5 to 29-year-olds in the world. More than disease, more than famine, and more than war. The largest killer of 5 to 29-year-olds in the world. And that led in February 2020 to something called the Stockholm Declaration. The Stockholm Declaration was a ministerial conference, took place obviously in Stockholm, attended by 140 countries. And it was, a lot of the work was pushed by the Towards Zero Foundation. And a target was agreed amongst those countries to reduce road deaths across the world by 50% by 2030. And DriveTech are very proud to be part of that campaign and proud to be signed up to that. It was a UN WHO event, ministerial conference, and only one country didn't sign up to that target, which was the USA. And the way they're going to achieve these targets is collaborative. So manufacturers, educators, the police, fleet operators, and the public, we all have a place to play if we're going to reduce road deaths by 50% by 2030. The EU hasn't been behind on this matter at all. This is a report from 2019 from the European Transport Safety Council. It found that 2,100 lives could be saved each year in the EU if the average speed dropped by only 1 kilometre an hour on all roads. It recommended mandatory installation of intelligent speed assistance. That measure alone is anticipated to cut deaths by 20%. And it observed that on most roads in the UK, speeding ranges from 9% to 75% above the limit. It came up with a number of suggested solutions. The first one was safe and credible speed limits. You'll see a lot more of these coming into force. 20 mile an hour in urban areas where pedestrians and vehicles interact, self-explaining, self-enforcing roads. The subject of today's webinar, vehicles that help drivers comply with speed limits. Stricter laws, big part for road user education, and all underpinned by effective and frequent traffic law enforcement. Being the EU, a lot of legislation was passed and it has some quite lengthy titles. You don't need to concern yourself with them. You do need to be aware that the UK and the EU technical standards will be aligned immediately after the 31st of December 2020. So despite Brexit, we are still signed up to the 50 by 30 target, and we will still be following the regulations. So what are they? Well, all motor vehicles are going to be equipped with the following advanced systems. Intelligent speed assistance, we'll come on to that in a little while. Alcohol interlock installation, that's not used in the UK, but it is used in some European countries where you have to blow a zero breath sample before you can drive, normally for convicted drink drivers. Driver drowsiness and attention warning, you've probably seen this on some cars, it's the coffee cup that lights up and tells you to take a break. Advanced driver distraction warnings, this is a new one. It tells you when you're actually being distracted when you're driving. Lane departure warning, you may have seen these, visual or haptic interfaces that tell you that you're crossing lanes without indicating. Emergency lane keeping assist, these are the systems that steer the car back into the lane if you're going to cause danger or keep you travelling in the middle of the lane, already standard on a lot of Volvos. Advanced emergency braking system, that's coming in 2 phases. The first one will detect objects and vehicles and apply the brakes. The second phase will detect pedestrians and cyclists. Emergency stop signal, this is already present on a lot of cars, the flashing stoplight under an emergency situation. Reversing detection, you may be familiar with, it is going to be standard on vehicles. And event data recorders. Fundamentally, it's the car's black box. It records data and will ensure that in a collision that data can be interpreted. The focus of this webinar is speed limiters, intelligent speed assistance, to be specific, how they work, how drivers operate them, asking the question, do drivers surrender control entirely to intelligent speed assistance? What happens when they don't work? And here are the critical dates. This is applicable to all passenger vehicles and most goods vehicles type approved after the 6th of July 2022. So any vehicles that are type approved after that date will have these systems fitted, and they must be operational on the car or lorry when it's sold, even if it's before the 2024 date. By the 7th of July 2024, every vehicle sold must have these systems fitted, even if they have to be retrofitted. So which vehicles does it actually apply to? It applies to cars, and it applies to all passenger vehicles. It now applies to vans. There were exemptions under previous regulations that vans didn't have to comply with the same regulations as cars. Neither did pickups. They had some exemptions. Now they're included. Large goods vehicles. Some of the features on large goods vehicles come in a little bit later. Those vehicles have a longer production run generally. Large passenger vehicles. Basically, all passenger vehicles and all goods vehicles will have these features fitted. And in case you're concerned, there is provision for an exemption for very low volume producers, so they can produce niche cars without having to undertake all the expensive tests that are required. So what is a speed limiter? Well, fundamentally, it's a performance standard. It's almost a test. It's not a technical specification. And the individual manufacturers choose how it operates. But it's all based on three potential systems that are out there. The first system that intelligent speed assistance can work on is map data. You're probably familiar with map data and sat-navs. It knows what road you're on, it knows what the speed limit is on that road, and then it will link that to the intelligent speed assistance to limit your speed to that road. But as we all know, that data can be out of date. The second system, a camera system, is fitted to cars that actually read the road signs, recognise that you're at a 50 limit, as in this case, and set the speed of your car to that. Once again, it's a really good system, providing it has a clear visibility of the road sign, suffers in bad weather, or if your view's obstructed by a large vehicle between you and the road sign. Most of the systems out there will use a combination of these two methods when they initially go live. The third method, and much more showing much more promise, is called CITS, Cooperative Intelligent Transport Systems. You've probably seen ITS, Intelligent Transport Systems. It's the purple cables you'll see down the sides of motorways, monitors the flow of cars, sets speed limits and directions accordingly if somebody's broken down. Cooperative Intelligent Transport Systems allow the car to talk to the sign to talk to the car, and importantly, cars to talk to other cars. So the sign will transmit its speed, that will appear in the car, set the speed limiter, and that can set different speeds for cars, different speeds for lorries, and even give different instructions, for example, asking a lorry to leave at the next exit before there was a vulnerable bridge in high winds or something of that nature. It's been tested in the UK, about a 3.5-year test on the A2-M2 corridor. That concluded on the 29th of February this year, and it was really, really encouraging. It's also live in Europe between Rotterdam and Vienna. So if you're driving down there and you've got one of these vehicles, it will operate. It's always been a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Which comes first? Do we build the infrastructure first, or do we build the cars first? That decision's sort of been taken out of our hands now, because car manufacturers are building this equipment and they're releasing it now. So the cars have come first, and we're now waiting for the infrastructure to catch up. So intelligent speed assistance, it is standard on a lot of vehicles, but you have to turn it on. It's standard on the new Golf 8. It's marketed by Volkswagen as Car to X. That means car to anything, car to traffic sign, car to traffic light, car to anything. But interestingly, when Golf have introduced this, although they fitted car to X on the whole Golf 8 range, not every model has intelligent speed assistance. The base model does, but the very popular style model doesn't get lane assistance, and looking at the specifications doesn't get speed limiters either. That asks a big question as to how manufacturers are approaching this. The other vehicles that are fitted with it, it's standard on all Jaguars, standard on a lot of Hondas, and a lot of the larger Fords. It's just gone standard on the Ford Transit Custom. This is going to be a lot of people's delivery drivers' first experience of these systems, and that is now standard feature on that van. But as before, you have to switch it on. So how do they work? How do you actually operate one of these things? It's all right saying you've got all these 10 systems on your car, but how do you operate them? The first thing is they will be on every time the car is started. If you switch it off and then start the car again, the systems come on, and that's for all the systems that I mentioned. All 10 of them will always be on. You can turn it off. Now, this was quite a debate because when the legislation was drafted, the system was permanently on, and that was the safest way. And that was based on manufacturers' claims that the system was completely reliable and they were trying to test fully autonomous vehicles on UK roads using these systems. But when the legislation went to consultation, the manufacturers said, well, actually, it's not that reliable and you need to turn it off when it goes wrong. And it was the turn-offable version that made it through to final legislation. You can override it in an emergency. So you press your accelerator down to the floor, your car will accelerate past the speed limiter. So that takes some of the concerns away. On the current range of speed limiters, you can choose how closely it follows the speed limit. And you can set them between up to 5 or 6 miles an hour above or below the limit. So you can have a car at the moment with intelligent speed assistance and set it to drive at 36 in a 30s. We don't know if that's going to make it through to the final legislative version. There is no standard operating procedure. Some systems are quite simple. You toggle it on and off with a button on the steering wheel, normally the speed limiter button, which is the traditional speed limiter, and you toggle it between speed limiter and intelligent speed assistance. Some systems are menu driven. You have to click through various menus to turn it off. And even manufacturers haven't standardized their operating procedure. For example, the 2020 Ford Focus, it's a menu driven system, but the way you turn the system on and off is different dependent whether you have the small touchscreen or the large touchscreen fitted to your car. Accuracy. The best accuracy is 95%. Maybe closer to 80% for some systems. Coupled with all this new technology is something called event data recorders. This is for more than just collision investigation. They're the black box of the car, a system with the only purpose of recording and storing critical crash-related parameters and information before, during, and immediately after a collision. It records on a loop, so it's always overwriting itself, so there's not a lot of historical data in there, but there will be data immediately surrounding the crash. It will record the vehicle speed, the braking, position and tilt of the vehicle on the road, the state and rate of activation of all the safety systems, high levels of accuracy, and crash survivability. And that data is available for the purpose of accident investigation and analysis, providing national laws permit it. It's a rich source of data, but is it also a source of influence in driver behaviour? Because they know that if they do something wrong, the spy in the cab, as it used to be called for tachographs, is watching them. This next slide is just to give an indication of the rate at which vehicles with speed limiters will appear on our roads. The line at the top, sitting around 39 million vehicles, is the current number of vehicles on the UK road. They're increasing at about 600,000 vehicles per year. So the top line just shows over the next 20 years an approximation of how many vehicles will be on the UK road. That's providing previous trends have been followed and providing things don't change drastically. The lower line and the lower segment is vehicles with intelligent speed assistance. Some of those vehicles are already appearing on our roads, but from 2024, every vehicle sold will have to have intelligent speed assistance. This brings an interesting point that somewhere around 2029 or 2030, about 1/3 of all the vehicles that are in use on the UK roads will have intelligent speed assistance. Does that create a pace car effect? Does that 1/3 of the vehicles, do they regulate the speed of all the other vehicles? How do the other vehicles react with that many vehicles with intelligent speed assistance? Do other drivers understand what's happening? Does the intelligent speed assistance set different speed limits for vans and cars that they can't exceed? There are a number of questions about the interaction between drivers of more modern cars and drivers of older cars when some are equipped with this system and some aren't. So we get towards the conclusions of the white paper. The first one is, will drivers know how to safely use the equipment? Every system is different. I found one manufacturer where the instructions on how to turn the intelligent speed assistance on and off were on page 427 of the manual, clearly the first page you turn to when you buy a new car. What is the role of car salespeople? What is the role of fleet operators? Are they agents of change or agents of resistance? Will this equipment induce a false sense of security in drivers? And I know Dr. Helen Wells is going to talk to that a bit later. What are the risks and implications of the 5% error rate? And 5% is the best. That's been claimed by Ford, tested in Germany. Does that mean that 19 out of every 20 journeys work perfectly? Or does it mean that one in every 20 traffic signs you pass is interpreted wrongly? What if the true error rate is closer to 80%, which is what Renault found when tested in bad weather in France? That could mean 1 in 5 traffic signs is incorrectly interpreted. What is the effect on the driver? And is a single, once and for life driving test sufficient to equip the modern motorists to be safe on the roads? I learned to drive in a 4-speed Toyota Corolla with wind-up windows. Is that good enough for beyond 2020? And there are some serious implications for roads policing. There are practical implications. Driver behaviour. Is the driver responsible for their actions? Well, legally they are. Or do they actually become a passenger behind the wheel? What about deliberate subversion of the system? How long before somebody develops a plug and play box that turns the system off every time you're in the car? Do the system errors give a moral excuse for speeding? They don't give a legal excuse for speeding, but do they give a moral excuse because the car told me the speed limit was wrong? What happens when cars can't speed? Speed offences are the major source of referral for driver offender education courses. What happens when cars can't speed and those drivers aren't prosecuted for speeding as much and therefore miss out on the education opportunities? Can an error in the system mitigate criminal liability? We may wish to use evidence that a person is driving at 40 miles an hour in a 30s as evidence of being liable for their actions. But what if the car says it was okay to drive at 40? How will the courts view that? Interesting point. Can you speed away in a stolen car? I have a feeling that some of our crooks might be the early adopters of this technology. When we investigate collisions, when should event data recorder be seized? Every collision? Serious collisions? Fatal collisions? How do we obtain the event data recorder? What authorities do we need? Can it be downloaded locally? Does it require the manufacturer to supply it? What about when we find the system has been switched off? Is that evidence of culpability, or is it evidence that the system wasn't working very well? And on a wider basis, how do we actually influence the new norm? How will they cope if they can't operate their own climate control in the cars? How will they cope when all these 10 new systems come in together? In terms of education, offending behaviour is at the moment regarded as a choice. It's something a driver chooses to do, and we help them to make better choices. Is that going to be true in the future? Or could some of that offending behaviour actually just be a knowledge gap? Is the lifetime licence sustainable? And the fear of event recording, can it influence choices? Can we use that event recorder data in a positive way? In terms of policy, what's the position on the police on these changes? What about public concern about loss of control? What about public concern about data recorders? There is a precedence for this in tachographs when they were introduced in lorries. Maybe we can learn lessons there. And in terms of training, emergency response, how will emergency response people cope with these systems? Switching from patrol to pursuit mode, can you actually do that in live time? When we're driving around towns and cities in emergency vehicles, we'd expect these systems to be on to protect the public. If they're not on and we have an accident, that asks big questions. But then when an event takes place that we need to respond to or pursue, can we actually switch all of these systems off fast enough to be able to respond or to pursue other vehicles? Is the authorised professional practice for police driving, is it suitable? Does it need reviewing? And are we upskilling existing drivers for the new technology? And ladies and gentlemen, that was a bit of a gallop through intelligent speed assistance and some of the new safety features on vehicles. And I'd like to hand back to Nick, if I may.
Ian, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I found that very instructive and thought-provoking, and I think I can see from the reaction of our panelists that there's been some interesting and impactful content there. Let's go straight to Helen Wells. Hopefully our speakers are all giving a clue as to what's my line in terms of their setting behind them. You've got Bernard Ricks there with Policing Insight. You've got John Apter with the long arm of the law on the sideboard behind him, and Helen, chair of the Roads Policing Academic Network. What are your reflections to what we've been hearing?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating paper. Thank you, Ian, and a fascinating context. I'm probably going to continue with the theme from the end of Ian's presentation about asking questions rather than necessarily answering them at the moment. But my interest here is largely in relation to how drivers are going to respond to this. And it's great, I think, that the part of the paper is about thinking about not just the technical challenges, but really about the challenges once this stuff comes out of the lab, because I think we know a lot of technologies that work really, really well in the lab. They were reliable, they did what they were supposed to do, and then they were let loose on the public, and we didn't always get the outcome that we expected. And I think hopefully we as a society are learning the importance of thinking about the sociology of technology, not just its on-off ability, how much it works, etc. As Ian said, we've also got the fact that this is only, even in the lab, it's only 95% accurate, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think we have some challenges here. Yes, there are opportunities, definitely. The idea of being able to knock a few miles an hour off people's speed is very attractive. We know the influence of speed on road casualties. So if there's something that can reduce that, of course, we want to explore the potential of it. I think I've got concerns though, or at least questions about whether if drivers really like it, but equally if they don't really like it. So either way, I'm a sort of a bit of a doom monger in that respect. I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things, but we need to have these conversations. If drivers really like it and really use it, I think yes, we can look to reduce speeds. Brilliant. My concern is the sort of idea that creeps in when we talk about this sort of stuff, that if we can get people to do the speed limit, nobody dies through speed-related collisions, which I think is incorrect. We don't want drivers, manufacturers, policymakers, governments, anybody to think that that's the problem solved. There will be no need to think about speed anymore because no one's breaking the limit. Now if you unpick it even a little bit, puts a fantastic amount of faith in the fact that the limit is the right speed. And what it does, I think, is distract attention from the fact that inappropriate speed also causes casualties. So you don't want to be in a position where you've got people saying, I can't possibly kill anyone, I'm doing 29, just regardless of the amount of people on their bonnet, right? So we can't end up in a situation where people say, I'm doing the limit, I can't possibly hurt anybody, I'm going to kick back a bit. And I think that's one of the problems with a lot of these developments, is that we may, as drivers, put our faith in them to the extent that we stop thinking for ourselves. Speed choice has to be subjective. It has to be not an automated, not an AI version of safety. It has to be a human common sense version of safety. You can't just trust the limit to always be right in all circumstances, regardless of whether it's pouring down with rain at 3 p.m. outside of school. You can't just trust 30 to always inherently be correct. But that is a little bit, I think, about what these systems try to do. So we need to be very aware of resisting that idea that this is problem solved. We need people to continue to think subjectively about whether it's the right speed to do in those circumstances. I think the issue of the mixed fleet is also really interesting. Will vehicles, once they get to perhaps a tipping point, have a pace car effect? We possibly. To be a doom monger again, do we actually then see an increased market interest for vehicles that are pre-limiters, that are exempt from limiters? Do they become attractive because, well, if everybody else is having to slow down, I can steal a march on them in my 1976 Hillman Avenger, for example. I think if drivers decide they don't like the technology, I think one of the interesting things about technology, and something that I've written about in the past, is people, if they're not normatively, internally committed to why the technology exists, they will look for ways around it. If they are committed to why it exists, arguably they don't need it because they were going to be good anyway. If taking CCTV as an example, taking speed cameras, taking speed limiters, alco locks, if people aren't subscribed to why the technology is needed, they will spend their time looking at ways around it. They will focus on what they can do, not what they should do. And we see that in coronavirus lockdown restrictions. People say, but now I can do so and so. And that part of the brain that says, should I, actually is quite suppressed by this kind of creative way of gaming it to get round it. And I do worry a little bit that if drivers aren't subscribed to why the technology should restrict them, they will find that it's malfunctioned quite often, or they will try and tamper with it, or as Ian said, some creative soul will come up with something that switches it off for you. And that won't necessarily be illegal because these things can be overridden, etc. Moving on very briefly, if I may, to effects on the police, and we've got actually a much better panel for talking about the impact on the police than I, but that won't stop me anyway. I'll punt some few things in. I'm interested in how collision investigators are trained to deal with this. As Ian said, lots of different systems, lots of different need for forensic understanding of different systems. How does the whole criminal justice system respond to this? Strict liability, speeding is a strict liability offence. How does that sit with the fact that the car told you one thing? You should have somehow known that the speed limit was different to what the car said. How does strict liability work when you've got some other kind of authority sitting between you and the law? I'm posing it as a question because I haven't got the answer. So that's how does it affect the wider criminal justice system? The police won't stop thinking about speed. Their job is not done in relation to speed. They just have to adapt to looking at inappropriate speed, more subjective offences, potentially harder to prove, more court time. You can't really, sorry, that's my phone. Somebody will get that. There we go. You can't really, throwing me now. You can't have technology to detect inappropriate speed because the appropriateness is a quality of the condition, the context. So how does the criminal justice system then deal with more examples of inappropriate speed? Again, questions, not answers. And I think the very final point I would make, if I may, is about this tendency to see the techno fix as the future, but let's not forget what processes we have to go through to make something techno fixable. You have to turn safety, that subjective interpreted concept, into a dichotomy: safe, dangerous, safe, dangerous. And actually, it often ain't like that. So there is no inherently safe distance between vehicles. There is no inherently safe speed, etc. And I think
Helen,
that whole...
let me stop you there. Thank you. I'm just keen to move on, but fascinating contributions. But we should have left ourselves longer for this. I instantly realised that. But just one very quick comment. If anybody wanted to see evidence of a false sense of security induced by technology, they need have looked no further than the match between Aston Villa and Sheffield United last evening, when just before half time, the ball went into the goal and scored a goal for Sheffield United. And everybody looked at the referee expecting him to blow his whistle.
I think that's allegedly on the goal being scored.
No, they've apologised, Bernard.
Okay.
So the referee looked at his watch and waited for it to buzz because the goal line technology was there to tell him that the ball had crossed the line. And the people operating the technology have since acknowledged that the ball did cross the line and it didn't happen. But everybody just trusted the watch and the buzzer on the referee's wrist over the evidence of their own eyes. And a classic example. Anyway, enough of me. John, try and stick as close to 5 minutes as you can. I know you have a lot to say.
You'll have to give me a nudge, Nick. So thank you very much. I think this is fascinating. And very, very briefly, first of all, thank you for asking me to be a panelist. Very briefly, my experience, just to let you know why I'm so passionate about roads policing and road safety. I've been a police officer for just over 27 years, and a good chunk of that, I was a roads policing officer, and I was a road death investigator, not on the technical side, the forensic side, I was on the investigation side, but I was also a family liaison officer during that time, which made me see the devastating impact of inappropriate speed, inappropriate driving, dangerous driving, and so on. So I've always been really passionate about road safety. Roads policing has always had a bad press, whether it's from some aspects of the public, whether it's from within our own organisation. And it's always seen too often as a nice to have, not an essential. I've always said roads policing is absolutely an essential part of policing. Now, what the public often see is, or often tell us, is that, well, all us roads policing officers do is a bit of speed enforcement. And I think that says a lot about our society, because when we talk about speed, inappropriate speed, and I completely agree with Helen, it's not all about, the speed limit is not a target. I've said that to so many motorists. And the report from Ian and the presentation was fascinating, because what I think as a society is we haven't really got to grips with the impact of inappropriate speed. I think some of the advertising campaigns over the years, we've been too shy to be too realistic. I've seen some from overseas which have been really impactful, whether it's about drink drive, drug drive, inappropriate speed. So I think if the government are going to help us on this journey, I think we have to start pushing boundaries about really rubbing it in the face of the public, not in an appropriate way, but in a realistic way, to say, if people drive like this could be the consequences. So roads policing and technology, it has changed massively over the years. I remember a number of years ago, I was dealing with a fatal collision involving a BMW, and the vehicle had black box technology, and it's very new. We were all very excited. None of us really knew what we were doing. We did, but we didn't have the experience, just to qualify that. And our forensic team hadn't had the experience. We had to get a judge's warrant to go to BMW to get the information that we needed, and eventually we managed to get a conviction. What we have found now is, over the years, forces, especially the forensic collision investigation teams, roads policing teams, work so closely with the manufacturers, but it still means that there's legislative hurdles that we have to go through. And when we look at driver behaviour, and there's so many, I'm not going to have the answers, by the way, I'm just giving some of the context. What we find with driver behaviour is we are not there yet, and Helen is far more of an expert on this than I. But when we deal with motorists, far too many, and I'm talking about good people, not criminals behind the wheel, good people will look at ways to overcome technology to make life for them easier. Now, technology comes in a number of different ways. And one of my concerns as a police officer is that we are overloading the motorist. I mean, driving is, it's a privilege, it's not a right. Technically, it's far more technical than it ever used to be. And I agree with Ian. I think questions have to be asked about the driving license process, and I'm a strong advocate that there needs to be regular tests throughout people's driving life. but that's a different issue. So when it comes to technology, first of all, it started off with things like sat-nav and mobile phone technology, and the legislation came in, so it all became hands-free. But there's so much going on within a vehicle, You've got head-up displays now. I mean, even in the policing world, I push back strongly against chief officers who have turned police vehicles into mobile offices. And, especially I was pursuit trained and VIP trained. When you're involved in a pursuit, we are trained in this country to an extraordinary high level. You are given so much information that you have to process in a split second. And it's getting like that now for the motorist. And I can just give you Ian spoke about what is the responsibility on those who sell vehicles. I don't know about people watching this, but I get the sense that people buy vehicles in a different way now. I bought a car last year, and it was the first time I've ever bought a car without even seeing it, without test driving it. I bought it online, and it was delivered without any handover at all. Now, the first time I drove on the motorway, and I'm ashamed to say this because I'd like to consider myself a good driver. I've been highly trained in the past, although my police force reminds me repeatedly that I'm no longer an advanced police driver, but I think I'm a good driver. And I went to change lanes on the motorway without indicating, and the lane discipline kicked in. And I thought the vehicle had developed a fault. I really panicked. Now that's my fault, but it also shows you, if somebody like me, who I feel is a reasonable driver, pretty good with technology, then people are getting behind the wheel of vehicles without knowing what their technical ability is, and it's throwing information at you that people are not prepared for. Whole issue about legislation. How is this ambitious timeline going forward about reducing casualties, which is really important? How is the legislation going to help and support us? I'm fearful that it'll just be the legislators will say, over to you, police, it's your problem, and that's not fair. We can't do it that way. The public have absolutely got to buy in, and if we don't do this with a concerted education campaign about all aspects of driving and the fundamental basics that driving is a privilege, it's not a right, and these can be the impacts if you're inappropriate driving. Also invest in roads policing. Look, I don't want to make the point too much because I've made it many times. Over the last 10, 12 years, we've seen massive cuts across all public sector. Policing has been battered. And what chiefs and others have had to decide, chief constables, is, well, what do I stop doing? And that's where we go back to roads policing was seen as a nice to have. And roads policing was decimated. And what did we see? We started to see fatal and serious injury collisions start to increase. And when police officers, I'm a big advocate of technology. I remember when speed cameras first came in. Yes, I am that old. I remember saying to the press at the time, I'm a big advocate of speed cameras in the appropriate place, but it's got to go hand in hand with enforcement from police officers, because it's police officers who will stop people for a moving traffic offence, but then they'll be looking for the drink, the drugs, the criminality. Criminals use our roads. Some of the best ways to target criminals is through driving, because we can really hinder their ability to travel across areas. I know I'm swaying off the subject, but
while you say, let me just stop you there, John. We need to get to questions. We've got a nice number of questions coming in. There's one actually which I'm just going to ask you to comment on, which is coming from Tim Ashman, who says widespread use of average speed cameras could actually have a significant effect on speed compliance, but it's not really regarded as socially acceptable. How do we move public opinion on this, as it will be needed to make new ISA technology widely desirable among road users?
Absolutely. I don't know if this is Tim Ashman, who used to be a roads policing officer. Is that Tim? Used to be my sergeant. Oh, Tim, welcome. Tim, I think speed cameras, unfortunately, because the way they've been introduced and they've been seen by some, please don't say this is what I'm saying they are, as nothing more than a cash cow. Because the way they were introduced was very poor. Even some of our speed awareness back in the day, the way it was introduced, really poor. It was seen as just income generation. I think to try and reverse that psychologically with the motorist is going to be really difficult. And speed cameras, you will see on the motorways, people see the speed cameras as a bit of a game, so they'll speed in between. I think average speed cameras are far better, far more effective. I think they've got to be more built into the education, the driving test, start targeting the youngsters at schools and colleges about the inappropriate use. Speed cameras can save lives, but it's got to go hand in hand with other appropriate enforcement. Long way
I've
to go.
another question. Thank you very much, John. A question which I'm hoping you might be able to help us out with, Ruth. And this comes from John McBride, who's wondering where the kind of policy response to this is, and not just confined to the specific questions in the white paper, but there are broader changes afoot, aren't there, in terms of autonomous vehicles, etc., etc. And we know with your role, Ruth, you have an insight into what's going on, you know, at government level, and indeed at the level of the National Police Chiefs Council. And I guess John's just looking for some reassurance that these issues have been picked up on. I'll give you 30 seconds thinking time by just reading a comment from Keith Lumley, who clearly, in response to the Aston Villa story, his comment is, "We were robbed," which is absolutely true, but he accepts it is a good analogy. Ruth, what's the policy response? How's that coming along?
Okay, well, hello to everybody. Thank you for inviting me along, and hello to Keith Lumley, a fond friend from the past. Hope you're doing well, Keith. You're quite right, Nick. There's no doubt about it. We do need leadership in road safety globally. I think Europe has a history of leading the way, and I think this legislation and its introduction is evidence of leadership, because we had plateaued, and 70 people in Europe and 5 people in the UK losing their lives every day is not a satisfactory position. But anytime you introduce changes such as this, what you're actually doing is bringing about the war between conformity brought about with technology versus human behavioural choices. And that is a very difficult area to understand. And that does give problems for policymakers, because you can't just, my own view is, you can't introduce technology without the policy and the education and the training to go with it. And I support John's view. I think roads policing officers are very skilled, highly skilled, much needed, perhaps undervalued. They work in the most dangerous conditions, I think, for most police officers, and they will need the training and the understanding to go along with this. But it's not just police officers who will need that training, it's the public. You can't just introduce seismic changes like this without educating the public and taking them with you. And I think that has to start with that journey of, when you purchase a vehicle, you have information and training that enables you to understand the technology, and I use that word rather than vehicle, the technology that you're using to drive. Because there's no doubt about it, the vehicle is becoming a computer. It's becoming limited in some respects because of that, because such technology and such limiters will not help us when we have to choose the right speed for the right conditions, which is often why a lot of people do speed and go over the limit, as well as fatigue, as well as complacency. I know this route, I've been driving it a long time. Most people offend because of that. So the policymakers do need to look at this. In a previous role, I was party to many meetings where policymakers from this country and Europe were discussing what laws we require to support the introduction of this change in a manufacturing level. And they do need to be thought out. I haven't seen the detail. I know it's been considered. What I do hope is that seminars and webinars such as this can influence that policy creation, so that we can have a say and help them when it's introduced, so that the policy making becomes an advocacy of the introduction of the technical changes here.
Excellent, thank you. In a moment, I'm going to come back to Charlie Norman on the basis that DriveTech is in the training business and in the driver risk business. I'm keen to hear Charlie's thoughts about what this evolution of the driving test system might mean to include a kind of lifelong component. But before that, Ruth, we've been asked a question by Paul Farley, who's asking, where do we see enforcement of these safety measures sitting? How's compliance going to be monitored against a backdrop where undoubtedly there'll be certain individuals who want to circumvent the safety measures? Well,
yes, the public see enforcement predominantly with police officers, and that's why any law changes needs to be well thought through. And historically in the UK, we're not quick to change the law in respect of road traffic offences. You know, some of our offences go back pre-1971 and they haven't been changed, others more laterally. So I think predominantly it will rest with police officers, but I think you're bringing into account here health and safety legislation and manufacturing legislation. So I think it will be multifaceted, but from the public's perspective, they will expect the police to enforce. And therefore, that needs to be recognised by government funding for police forces to enable us to have the right number of officers and support staff supporting us as we address this issue on our roads. Because John's point for me was very important. If people don't understand the impact of these technological changes, they could cause accidents, fatalities and collisions, and we really need to think that through.
Excellent. So, Charlie, we've been asked a question about what should happen, what needs to change, or what are the options for changing and move away from the current L test. You know, people get a license generally in their teens or early 20s to drive for the rest of their adult life. If we were to take a fresh look at that, what sort of options do you think there might be?
Thanks, Nick. I think it's probably worth there's probably two elements that I would just go back with on this. I think John mentioned there when he took over ownership of a new vehicle and the experience that John had with little or no handover. I think that's a valid point in time where we should be looking to try and make sure that motorists are educated. Ian made the point that some instructions on how to use some of these safety features are hidden away on page 400 of a manual. And I'm not sure I know too many people who sat and read the manual for their car. So I think certainly with any type of vehicle, some kind of accessible, affordable type of either digital training or some kind of interactive training for that vehicle should be something that manufacturers should be thinking about quite carefully, particularly with all these features coming in, because I think hiding how these things work in a book as opposed to something that could be presented via video or some kind of e-learning, I think is an obvious thing that we should be trying to push manufacturers to do. Certainly from a DriveTech point of view, we would like to, we've been talking to some manufacturers about how we can enhance that process and how we can enhance that customer experience in terms of taking over a new vehicle. That's a point in time. I think in terms of the lifelong driving license, I think for me, what's changed over the last few years is the ability we now have to deliver driver education in a way that doesn't involve people retaking a driving test every 10 years, because actually what we could do now is some form of online, and particularly through this lockdown period, we've moved all of our police speed awareness courses online, and I think they've been very effective. And I think that shows that there is a way that we can continue to educate people and get behavioural changes Ruth talked about, and knowledge of how cars and systems work in a format that, like I say, doesn't involve people taking another actual physical test. Obvious times for me to look at that. We all need to renew our photo card every 10 years. For me, that would be a suitable sort of period of time where, as part of that process, I will be renewing my driving license photo card, and at that point I would also do some kind of driver refresher training. That for me, so I think there's two elements. I think there's new vehicle piece training requirement, and some kind, even though I'm not getting new vehicles, some kind of regular refresher training, not just about the vehicles, but about more broader things in terms of our roads. So that would be my sort of initial view, Nick.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got a suggestion or a question from Craig Arnold, who's asking perhaps the driver CPC approach could be adapted for car drivers, that the certificate of professional competence, which bus, coach and lorry drivers have.
Yes, I mean, I think that works effectively where you're a professional driver, or that's your role. I think CPC works, I think, over a period of 5 years in terms of how many hours of training you need to do, and I think that's another alternative to looking at it every 10 years. In fact, that could be equally as effective because it's more regular intervention. So yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion as well.
A couple of other quick comments. I'm then just going to come back to John and Helen for any sort of parting thoughts before we get to Bernard to summarise. But just Keith Lumley has conquered his disappointment about the football last night to make the comment about picking up on your point, John, Apter, about dealerships, and just saying you're absolutely right. Dealerships aren't going through the standard briefings to customers on new cars. They're signposting to manuals and videos, and they're using COVID as an excuse to do that. Maybe there's something we can do about that. Paul Farley saying here the technology also has impacts on the insurance industry. Has the panel given any thought as to how that might change? Are the car and driver going to be separately insured? If the car makes a decision to do something and the driver then makes a decision to do something else, who's responsible for that? There's a couple of other comments in here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to leave one or two questions unasked just to get some final thoughts. We've got a hard stop at midday. Helen, any thoughts on what you've heard that you've not already made? You're muted.
Thank you. I came into this with a long list of questions, some of which I've had answers, and now I've got an even bigger list of questions. I think I don't want to take away from the potential of this. I appreciate my contribution was quite challenging, but I do think speed is on the radar. I think that's a really important point, and I think it needs to be. We just need a conversation about how we approach that.
Excellent. John, any parting thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting time, but we can't allow ourselves to be so absorbed with technology is going to be the fix for everything, because I think it's going to add a different dimension of problems. And I think the question asked about the insurance, fascinating, because if people will expect a discount in the insurance premiums if they have a black box fitted or so on, well, what if the police then find that they've been disconnected? How are we going to deal with that? It's raised so many more questions, but I think that's a good thing. The big thing for me is it puts road safety, driver education, road policing on the map, and that needs to be absolutely fixed there and continue this debate going forward. So a brilliant event, if I may say so, and some really good points raised.
Ruth, any final thoughts from you?
No, just to echo everything that's been said, I've got lots of questions myself, which I certainly will take away. But I think Charlie is right. I think online through COVID has taught us that there is another medium there that we can all perhaps explore to see if we can support the motorist to become safer motorists when this technology is introduced.
Excellent, thanks very much. And Bernard, it falls to you to close this down. I think it's been a fascinating hour, really good attendance, really good contributions, and I hope you're already thinking that there might be a role for Policing Insight in continuing this debate moving forward. But
I've got a minute to summarise 57 minutes of fantastic input from great contributors and some great questions as well. I'm just going to thank DriveTech for putting this on first and foremost, and I'm sure that I do so on behalf of most, if not all, of the audience here. Two key points. I think Helen first used the expression "more questions than answers." I think we've given a resounding nod to yes, absolutely there are. Ian used the expression significant policing implications. Personally, I think the policing implications go beyond traffic policing. All this technology, is the Information Commissioner's Office going to take an interest? What's in dealing with drug dealers and the like? Does this technology have implications that widely? I seem to remember reading somewhere, and it may have been within the really useful report that's put together, that one of the largest causes of death for 18 to 30-year-olds is found on the road. So this is a very significant issue. That's probably my minute and a half's worth. Nick, I better hand back to you.
Indeed, thanks very much, Bernard. And let's all have a think about where we can do. There are more comments on the screen, more questions coming in. Really good feedback from Jason Ross and from Philip Robb and unanswered questions. So let's think about there's potentially scope for a follow-up event, a further discussion. Certainly, there are some substantial unanswered policy questions, but it just falls to me to close this down. Thanks, Ian Bint, for your report and for your presentation of it, which really brought some knotty issues to life. Thanks to DriveTech and Policing Insight for arranging this webinar. And as the rain falls ever harder on the window next to me, we can all go away and do other things, but thanks everybody, participants, for joining in and for your questions and comments. Goodbye.
Very welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.